Chapter 7: The Golden Con. As 1827 drew to a close, Joseph Smith had supposedly retrieved the golden plates from the hill Cumorah. According to the LDS Church, he immediately faced relentless persecution. Thieves and skeptics alike, the story goes, were scheming to steal these sacred artifacts. The threat was so severe that Joseph and Emma had no choice but to flee, abandoning Palmyra for the relative safety of Harmony, Pennsylvania, where Joseph could finally begin his divine translation work in peace. It was a dramatic tale. Joseph's warnings about wicked men plotting to seize the plates seemed to be coming true before the eyes of his family and friends. But the account is misleading, deliberately so. The real reason for leaving. Isaac Hale's own testimony cuts through the mythology. Far from fleeing persecution, Joseph had been offered a fresh start, a place to live, land to work, and a chance at honest labor. Isaac recalled the arrangement plainly. Smith stated to me that he had given up what he called glass-looking, and that he expected to work hard for a living and was willing to do so. He also made arrangements with my son Alva Hale to go to Palmyra and move his Smith's furniture and secra to this place. He then returned to Palmyra, and soon after Alva, agreeable to the arrangement, went up and returned with Smith and his family. This was no desperate escape. It was a planned relocation, arranged weeks in advance. LDS apologists Mark L. Staker and Curtis Ashton confirm that Joseph and Emma moved to Harmony in December 1827. What they carefully omit is the nature of the so-called persecution. These weren't random antagonists or religious bigots. They were Joseph's former partners, men who had worked alongside him in treasure-seeking ventures, men who believed they had a stake in whatever Joseph had found. Another apologist, Larry C. Porter, paints the scene in darker colors. Following repeated attempts to steal the plates and constant threats of bodily harm to the prophet by local antagonists, Emma's brother Alva was summoned. Isaac Hale's own account contradicts this dramatic framing. Joseph had already agreed to return to Harmony with Emma. Alva's assistance wasn't an emergency extraction. It was a prearranged moving service. The truth is harder to romanticize. These weren't antagonists. They were business partners. Joseph had commissioned Willard Chase to build him a box. He'd enlisted Beeman to modify another. Both men were former treasure-hunting associates. Both believed they had been cut out of a venture they'd helped facilitate. Smith wasn't being persecuted. He had simply conned his way out of a partnership, and he had no intention of staying in Palmyra to face the consequences. Isaac Hale's statement makes that abundantly clear. The church, as usual, was whitewashing events that didn't fit its preferred narrative. The con takes shape. I believe Joseph never intended to include his former partners in the Golden Plates project, because he never intended to pursue it seriously at all. Not until Isaac Hale forced his hand. The confrontation with Emma's father changed everything. Smith had promised Justice Neely he would stop treasure hunting. He'd made the same promise to Isaac. He needed a new scheme, something that didn't involve manual labor but could still generate income. The Golden Plates provided the perfect cover story. A treasure hunt disguised as divine revelation. A money-making venture wrapped in religious authority. He could pivot on the fly, exclude the partners he'd never planned to work with anyway, and claim divine mandate for doing so. After all, back in 1825, Joseph had supposedly known about these plates. He and Samuel Lawrence could have dug them up together, but neither had ever lifted a shovel. It was theater, not archaeology. Posturing, not prophecy. The move to Harmony. In November 1827, Alva Hale arrived in Manchester to help Joseph and Emma with their move. According to Joseph's own account, they were very poor and the persecution so heavy upon us that there was no probability that we would ever be otherwise. The poverty was real enough, the persecution less so. Stephen E. Snow, church historian and member of the Quorum of the 70, describes the journey with fitting melodrama. As Joseph and Emma prepared to leave with Alva, Joseph and Alva each placed a heavy club in the wagon for defense, and they hid the box containing the plates in a barrel, filled the barrel 1/3 full of beans, and sealed the lid. They arrived in Harmony in December. Heavy clubs for defense, hidden plates in a bean barrel. It reads like an adventure novel. Snow also notes that Smith received critical financial support during this period. We found a friend in a gentleman by the name of Martin Harris, who came to us and gave me $50 to assist us in our affliction. Enter Martin Harris. Martin Harris. We've encountered him before, and his role in the early Mormon narrative cannot be overstated. Harris lived in the Palmyra area until 1831, though from 1828 to 1830 he spent most of his time in Harmony, shadowing Joseph's translation work. In 1824, Harris had hired Joseph Smith Sr. to dig a well and cistern. During that job, Smith Sr. had shared his son's story, the alleged visitation from the angel Moroni, the golden plates buried in the hill. Harris was well acquainted with the Smith family. More importantly, he was the perfect mark. Known for his superstitious nature and vivid imagination, Harris was prone to extraordinary spiritual experiences. One account captures his temperament perfectly. Once, while reading scripture, he reportedly mistook a candle's sputtering as a sign that the devil desired him to stop. Another time, he excitedly awoke from his sleep, believing that a creature as large as a dog had been upon his chest, though a nearby associate could find nothing to confirm his fears. Several hostile and perhaps unreliable accounts told of visionary experiences with Satan and Christ, Harris once reporting that Christ had been poised on a roof beam. In a letter to John A. Clark, Harris recounted one of his more memorable visions. No matter where he went, he saw visions and supernatural appearances all around him. He told a gentleman in Palmyra, after one of his excursions to Pennsylvania, while the translation of the Book of Mormon was going on, that on the way he met the Lord Jesus Christ, who walked along by the side of him in the shape of a deer for 2 or 3 miles, talking with him as familiarly as one man talks with another. Jesus Christ, in the form of a deer, walking along a Pennsylvania road, chatting casually. This was the man Joseph Smith chose as his financial backer. Stephen E. Snow frames Harris and Smith's relationship as if they only eventually met, conveniently omitting Harris's prior dealings with the Smith family. It's a recurring pattern in LDS historiography, selective memory about inconvenient connections. Harris, easily impressed by spiritual matters and hungry for divine validation, was an ideal target. He contributed $50 to support Joseph's translation work, and his involvement was just beginning. Trouble in Harmony. With money in hand and Alva ready to assist, the Smith family departed for Harmony in December 1827. But even in their new home, problems surfaced quickly. Larry C. Porter describes the tension with Isaac Hale. But even in Harmony, problems began to surface with Isaac Hale himself. When shown the box in which the gold plates had been placed, Isaac said that he was allowed to feel the weight of the box, but he was not permitted to see the plates. He then declared to Joseph, "If there was anything in my house of that description, which I could not be allowed to see, he must take it away." Isaac Hale was no fool. He could feel the weight of the box, sense something inside, but he couldn't see the contents. And he wouldn't tolerate mysteries under his own roof. Porter continues, Joseph was under a strict charge not to divulge the contents of the box to Isaac or anyone else. This difficult situation was alleviated when Isaac sold the prophet 13 acres of land a short distance away. A house formerly belonging to Emma's brother Jesse was then moved onto the property for their use. Porter's account contains an error. Joseph and Emma moved into Jesse Hale's former home, but it was already on the property. They didn't relocate it. More importantly, Joseph had promised Isaac he would reform. Isaac didn't sell the home to Smith until April 6, 1829. According to Joseph's own account, he was penniless and dependent on Martin Harris, who had invested only $50. The land purchase agreement is documented in the Joseph Smith papers. Where did Joseph get the $400 stated in the agreement? He had no visible income, no steady work, no explanation. Harris may have provided the funds. He would do so again during the Book of Mormon translation. More likely, Joseph was making payments on the home while still indebted to Isaac Hale, a debt that would shadow him for years. The timeline problem. The LDS Church maintains that Martin Harris required proof of the Book of Mormon's divinity before fully committing to the project. He's portrayed as a deeply religious man, cautious and discerning, unwilling to be deceived by anything evil or fraudulent. This interpretation is unconvincing. The timelines don't add up. The narrative collapses under scrutiny. Mark L. Staker and Curtis Ashton note in their article, Joseph and Emma Smith's Home. Joseph's first limited efforts had begun in December 1827 before the move to the house, but they continued in 1828. Emma helped her husband again briefly when he resumed work in 1829. Staker and Ashton align with Isaac Hale's time frame. Hale stated clearly, "About this time, Martin Harris made his appearance upon the stage, and Smith began to interpret the characters or hieroglyphics, which he said were engraved upon the plates, while Harris wrote down the interpretation." It was said that Harris wrote down 116 pages and lost them. Here's the problem. We're told that Harris wanted assurance of the Book of Mormon's legitimacy, that Smith transcribed characters from the golden plates onto paper, which was then taken to Columbia College professor Charles Anthon for authentication, the so-called Anthon paper. This event supposedly occurred in the winter of 1828, nearly a year after Harris allegedly began serving as Smith's scribe. According to LDS accounts, Harris didn't become Smith's scribe until February 1828. By June of that year, they had produced 116 pages of translation. But Isaac Hale claims the translations began in December 1827, 2 months earlier. In the same interview, Hale described Harris's growing frustration. "Soon after this happened, Martin Harris informed me that he must have a greater witness, and said that he had talked with Joseph about it. Joseph informed him that he could not, or durst not show him the plates, but that he, Joseph, would go into the woods where the Book of Plates was, and that after he came back, Harris should follow his track in the snow and find the book and examine it for himself. Harris informed me afterwards that he followed Smith's directions and could not find the plates and was still dissatisfied. The next day after this happened, I went to the house where Joseph Smith Jr. lived and where he and Harris were engaged in their translation of the book. Each of them had a written piece of paper which they were comparing, and some of the words were, 'My servant seeketh a greater witness, but no greater witness can be given him.' By the time the church claims Harris became the scribe, Smith and Harris had already been working together for several months. If Hale's account is accurate, and Harris approached him after losing the 116 pages, that places the event in June, still 6 months before the Anthon encounter. Would Harris, supposedly desperate for proof of the Book of Mormon's authenticity, really wait half a year to a full year before seeking professional validation? It strains credibility. Some sources place Harris's scribing as beginning as late as April, giving us 3 conflicting dates. If Harris was genuinely eager for the Book of Mormon to be proven true, would he have delayed so long to obtain an expert opinion? Harris was already known for extraordinary spiritual claims, both positive and negative. He embraced visions, supernatural encounters, and divine manifestations with enthusiasm. It's far more likely that Harris fully embraced Joseph and his family's claims from the beginning and acted as a willing collaborator in establishing the Book of Mormon's authenticity. After all, Harris was notorious for shifting rapidly between religious movements. He was associated with at least 10 faiths outside of Mormonism. He reportedly held the Shaker's scriptural book in the same esteem as the Book of Mormon, a detail we'll revisit later. Harris wasn't a skeptic seeking proof. He was a believer seeking validation. The prophecy machine. Hale also recounted what he saw on the papers Smith and Harris were comparing. There was also something said about 3 that were to see the thing, meaning, I supposed, the Book of Plates, and that if the 3 did not go exactly according to the orders, the thing would be taken from them. I inquired whose words they were and was informed by Joseph or Emma, I rather think it was the former, that they were the words of Jesus Christ. This is revealing. Before the Book of Mormon was even near completion, before the visit to Charles Anthon, Smith and Harris were already planning for witnesses to the golden plates. This wasn't spontaneous revelation. It was narrative engineering. Smith claimed to be receiving divine revelations during this period, material that would later be compiled as the Book of Commandments and eventually renamed and edited as the Doctrine and Covenants. The prophecy about 3 witnesses wasn't prediction. It was setup. The translation method. During the translation of the 116 pages, Smith maintained a curtain between himself and Harris. Harris was never allowed to see the plates. Isaac Hale described the method in his 1834 interview. The manner in which he pretended to read and interpret was the same as when he looked for the money diggers, with the stone in his hat and his hat over his face, while the book of plates were at the same time hid in the woods. Let that sink in. The plates, these sacred, divinely preserved artifacts, were hidden in the woods, not even in the same room. Joseph sat with his face buried in a hat, staring at the same seer stone he'd used for treasure hunting, dictating words to a scribe who couldn't see what he was supposedly translating. This is where the LDS narrative fractures. The seer stone problem. Official LDS teachings have long maintained that Smith used the Urim and Thummim to translate the Book of Mormon, ancient artifacts that came with the golden plates, rooted in biblical tradition. Former LDS President Joseph Fielding Smith stated emphatically, "While the statement has been made by some writers that the prophet Joseph Smith used a seer stone part of the time in his translating of the record, and information points to the fact that he did have in his possession such a stone, yet there is no authentic statement in the history of the Church which states that the use of such a stone was made in that translation. The information is all hearsay, and personally, I do not believe that this stone was used for this purpose. The reason I give for this conclusion is found in the statement of the Lord to the brother of Jared as recorded in Ether 3:22-24. Doctrines of Salvation 3:2-25. For decades, this was the official position. The Urim and Thummim, ancient, biblical, legitimate, but the evidence became impossible to deny. In October 2015, the Church published a substantial article in Ensign, its official magazine for members, finally addressing Joseph Smith's use of seer stones. The young Joseph Smith accepted such familiar folkways of his day, including the idea of using seer stones to view lost or hidden objects. Since the biblical narrative showed God using physical objects to focus people's faith or communicate spiritually in ancient times, Joseph and others assumed the same for their day. Joseph's parents, Joseph Smith Sr. and Lucy Mack Smith, affirmed the family's immersion in this culture and their use of physical objects in this way, and the villagers of Palmyra and Manchester, New York, where the Smiths lived, sought out Joseph to find lost objects before he moved to Pennsylvania in late 1827. This directly contradicts earlier LDS scholarship. Richard Bushman, a respected LDS historian, had previously emphasized that Lucy Mack Smith insisted her family did not participate in folk magic practices. Now, church historians Robin S. Jensen, Mark Ashurst McGee, and Richard E. Turley Jr. were openly acknowledging the Smiths' deep involvement in occult traditions. One narrative must be false. Both cannot be true. All of these scholars are church employees. All are in good standing. All are paid to present firesides on challenging topics. Yet they cannot agree on basic facts about the church's founding. Jensen, Ashurst McGee, and Turley continue. For those without an understanding of how 19th century people in Joseph's region lived their religion, seer stones can be unfamiliar, and scholars have long debated this period of his life. Partly as a result of the Enlightenment or Age of Reason, a period that emphasized science and the observable world over spiritual matters, many in Joseph's day came to feel that the use of physical objects such as stones or rods was superstitious or inappropriate for religious purposes. And then comes the whitewashing. In later years, as Joseph told his remarkable story, he emphasized his visions and other spiritual experiences. Some of his former associates focused on his early use of seer stones in an effort to destroy his reputation in a world that increasingly rejected such practices. In their proselyting efforts, Joseph and other early members chose not to focus on the influence of folk culture, as many prospective converts were experiencing a transformation in how they understood religion in the Age of Reason. In what became canonized Revelations, however, Joseph continued to teach that seer stones and other seeric devices, as well as the ability to work with them, were important and sacred gifts from God. This is careful spin. The truth is simpler. Perceptions of magic hadn't significantly changed from Smith's time, but laws existed forbidding individuals from claiming the ability to divine treasures or lost objects for payment. The very practice Smith engaged in before 1828, the very practice that led to his 1826 legal troubles in the Glass Looker case. The Apologetics. Fair LDS, a pro-Mormon apologetics organization, attempts to defend Smith's use of the Seer stone. Joseph was given a set of Nephite interpreters along with the gold plates from which the Book of Mormon was produced. In addition, Joseph already possessed and utilized several Seer stones. Although Joseph began translating the Book of Mormon using the Nephite interpreters, he later switched to using one of his Seer stones to complete the translation. Critics, typically those who reject Mormonism but still believe in God, reject the idea that God would approve the use of an instrument for translation that had previously been used for money digging. The conclusion that Joseph used a magical or occult stone to assist in the translation of the Book of Mormon is entirely dependent upon one's own preconception that the use of such an instrument would not be acceptable by God. Believers, on the other hand, ought not to take issue with a distinction between one set of Seer stones versus another. As Brant Gardner notes, regardless of the perspective from which we tell the story, the essential fact of the translation is unchanged. How was the Book of Mormon translated? As Joseph continually insisted, the only real answer, from any perspective, is that it was translated by the gift and power of God. Gardner's statement is fundamentally flawed. The narrative absolutely changes depending on which instrument was used. A translation using ancient Nephite interpreters, rooted in Judeo-Christian tradition, divinely prepared artifacts, carries theological weight and biblical precedent. A translation using a stone Joseph dug out of a well while treasure hunting, the same stone that got him arrested, carries an entirely different set of implications. One narrative connects to ancient prophets and sacred history. The other connects to 19th century folk magic and fraud. These are not the same story. Isaac Hale's warning. Isaac Hale witnessed the translation process firsthand. He described it plainly. The manner in which he pretended to read and interpret was the same as when he looked for the money diggers, with the stone in his hat and his hat over his face, while the book of plates were at the same time hid in the woods. Hale didn't mince words about what he thought of the operation. I told them that I considered the whole of it a delusion and advised them to abandon it. After this, Martin Harris went away, and Oliver Cowdery came and wrote for Smith while he interpreted as above described. This is the same Oliver Cowdery, whose name may be found in the Book of Mormon. Cowdery continued a scribe for Smith until the Book of Mormon was completed as I supposed and understood. Hale saw through it from the beginning. The lost 116 pages. Martin Harris and Joseph Smith worked on the translation until June 1828, producing 116 pages of text. This section was later referred to as the Book of Lehi, the first portion of the claimed plates. At the end of this period, Harris asked Joseph for permission to take the manuscript back to Palmyra to show his wife, Lucy, who was highly skeptical of the entire project. Joseph initially refused. Harris petitioned again. Joseph refused. Harris petitioned a third time. Finally, Joseph consented, but only after Harris swore an oath to show the manuscript to just 5 specific people. Harris returned to Palmyra and showed the 116 pages to his wife. Lucy reportedly kept the manuscript locked in her dresser drawer, only taking it out when Martin wanted to display it to curious visitors. Then, after Martin forced access to the drawer, the 116 pages vanished. LDS historian Richard Bushman and others have speculated that Lucy Harris burned them. With the manuscript lost, Lucy Harris made a devastating demand. Joseph must reproduce the 116 pages exactly. If he truly possessed divine translation powers, if the plates were real and the process authentic, he should be able to recreate the text word for word. Of course, that didn't happen. Instead, Joseph received a convenient revelation explaining why he couldn't reproduce the lost pages. His enemies, he claimed, had altered the original manuscript and planned to expose any discrepancies when he retranslated it. But Lucy Harris wasn't finished. Saints, Volume 1, The Gift and Power of God, reveals previously unknown information. The following spring, Martin Harris traveled to Harmony with some bad news. His wife had filed a complaint in court, claiming Joseph was a fraud who pretended to translate gold plates. Martin now expected a summons to testify in court. He would have to declare that Joseph had fooled him, or Lucy would charge him with deceit as well. Lucy Harris had taken legal action. She wasn't just skeptical, she was actively trying to expose Joseph Smith as a con artist. The abuse. There's another disturbing element to this story. Lucy Mack Smith, Joseph's mother, reported that Lucy Harris had been seen with bruises and cuts. Martin Harris was known to be abusive. It has been proposed that Martin beat Lucy for making the 116 pages disappear. Lucy Harris herself swore in a statement, "He is naturally quick in his temper, and his mad fits frequently abuses all who may dare to oppose him in his wishes. However strange it may seem, I have been a great sufferer by his unreasonable conduct. At different times while I lived with him, he has whipped, kicked, and turned me out of the house." Fair LDS attempts to downplay this testimony. Despite the fact that Lucy Harris makes no mention of the lost 116 pages of manuscript from the Book of Mormon, Fawn Brody, in her book No Man Knows My History, The Life of Joseph Smith, actually concludes that Harris beat his wife in order to get her to divulge what she had done with the lost 116 pages of manuscript. They continue. Lucy's report of abuse is the most disheartening of the affidavit. While on one hand Lucy may have exaggerated some of the elements about Martin, these claims are those to take most seriously. This is the man Joseph Smith chose as his primary financial backer and scribe, a man prone to violence, a man whose wife feared him enough to file legal complaints and seek protection. What if it is a lie? Martin Harris's anger wasn't limited to physical violence. Lucy had been questioning his investment in Smith's project, a venture that was costing money with no returns. She had even filed a disorderly conduct case against Smith, a charge he would face twice more in 1830. In her interview with E.D. Howe, Lucy Harris recounted Martin shouting at her, "What if it is a lie? If you will let me alone, I will make money out of it." Fair LDS attempts to dismiss this statement. Abigail embellishes her version of what she heard by implying that Martin Harris admitted that Mormonism was a lie. But the quote stands on its own. Harris wasn't defending the Book of Mormon's truthfulness. He was defending its profitability. It's plausible that by this point, Harris was beginning to doubt Smith's claims. He was losing money. The project was consuming resources with nothing to show for it. But if the Book of Mormon could be published and sold, perhaps he could recoup his losses. Harris was expecting a return on his investment, and as we'll see in later chapters, Smith would eventually attempt to cut Harris out of any profits from Book of Mormon sale. Yes, sales. Because Smith planned to sell copies of the book, not distribute them freely. This wasn't scripture given to the world. It was a product. The setup theory. Some historians have proposed an alternative explanation for the lost pages. Martin and Lucy Harris may have been complicit in their disappearance as a test. If Joseph could reproduce the 116 pages perfectly, it would prove his prophetic authenticity beyond doubt. Martin could then present the original pages alongside the new translation, demonstrating that divine power was at work. This theory cannot be definitively proven, but it's worth considering. If true, it would explain why Martin was so invested in demanding reproduction of the lost text, and so angry when Joseph refused. The bigger picture, as we'll see in the coming chapters, Smith had a plan to publish the Book of Mormon for profit. Initially, he even claimed that he and his family intended to display the golden plates in their home for a fee. The sale of the Book of Mormon would become a recurring theme, a source of conflict between Smith and his early supporters. It's likely that Smith waited until he could produce a set of plates convincing enough to fool the average person. But events in the winter of 1828 forced his hand. Isaac Hale's confrontation, Emma's pressure, Harris's investment, all of it accelerated a timeline Smith hadn't fully prepared for. He had to improvise. He had to commit to the con before he was ready, and the cracks were already beginning to show. We'll conclude this chapter here. In the next, we'll examine the Anthon letter and the introduction of Oliver Cowdery, two critical elements in the construction of the Book of Mormon narrative.